Centuries of speculation and debate have surrounded the origins of the Slavs. Were they always a distinct people, hidden in the dense forests and vast river basins of Eastern Europe? Or did they arrive in waves, shaping and reshaping the lands they would come to dominate? For years, historians relied on ancient texts, scattered artifacts, and linguistic analysis to piece together the Slavic puzzle. But now, DNA has given us a time machine, a direct link to the past, revealing secrets buried for thousands of years. And what scientists have uncovered is rewriting history. Unlike the Germanic and Romance peoples of Western Europe, the Slavs appeared in historical records relatively late. 6th century Byzantine writers described them as fierce, numerous, and seemingly emerging from nowhere. But how could an entire civilization remain invisible for so long? Traditional theories place their homeland either in Poland's Odrvistula region or deep in the forests of Ukraine. The debate was fierce, with archaeologists and linguists arguing over which version of history was correct. Yet, for all their research, a crucial piece was missing: genetics. With modern advances in DNA analysis, the past has become more accessible than ever before. By studying the Y-chromosome, which passes unchanged from father to son, and mitochondrial DNA, which follows the maternal line, scientists have been able to trace the movements of ancient Slavic ancestors. The results are astonishing. The genetic markers of Slavic populations show an undeniable connection stretching across vast distances, from Poland to the Balkans, from Ukraine to the distant edges of Russia. And yet, within this unity, there are surprising fractures, subtle but undeniable differences that tell the story of migrations, invasions, and unexpected interactions with other civilizations. But here's where things take an even more unexpected turn. Genetic evidence doesn't just confirm the Slavs' presence in Central and Eastern Europe. It suggests they were there far earlier than previously believed. Ancient DNA from burial sites in Poland, Ukraine, and Serbia reveals genetic markers linked to Slavic populations appearing centuries before their supposed expansion. This discovery challenges long-held theories and suggests that rather than being a people who suddenly appeared and expanded, the Slavs were already present, slowly evolving and adapting within the heart of Europe. Even more intriguing, the genetic evidence shows clear ties to other groups. The Balto-Slavic connection, long suspected based on linguistic similarities, is confirmed through shared DNA, particularly in northern Belarus, where the influence of ancient Baltic tribes remains strong. And then there are the more distant influences, unexpected traces of East Asian and Siberian ancestry, revealing that some Slavic populations interacted with, or even absorbed, the genetic heritage of nomadic tribes like the Huns and Avars. The Balkans tell a different story, one of Mediterranean and Anatolian influences, a genetic legacy of Roman occupation and trade. So what does this mean for the history of the Slavs? It means that the traditional narrative of a mysterious people who erupted onto the scene in the early medieval period was never the full story. It means that the Slavs weren't just a people of warriors and farmers, but a civilization shaped by centuries of migration, interaction, and adaptation. It means that DNA has the power to reveal not just where we come from, but how history itself is written. For centuries, the story of the Slavs has been told through ancient texts, myths, and archaeological findings. But what if the true origins of the Slavic people have been hidden in plain sight? Not in manuscripts or relics, but within their very DNA. With cutting-edge genetic research, scientists are now able to look beyond speculation and into the bloodlines that shaped one of Europe's most widespread civilizations. The results? A history far older, more complex, and more interconnected than ever imagined. The Slavic genetic blueprint is dominated by a key Y-chromosome lineage, haplogroup R1a, found in high frequencies among Slavic populations. It was once thought to be the defining marker of their ancestry. But the truth is more nuanced. R1a is not exclusive to the Slavs. It stretches across Eurasia, from Scandinavia to India, carried by waves of migration dating back thousands of years. The Slavic branches of R1a, particularly the M458 and Z280 subclades, tell a different story. These lineages, heavily concentrated in Poland, Ukraine, and Western Russia, suggest an ancient presence in Central and Eastern Europe, possibly as far back as the Late Bronze Age. This challenges the long-standing belief that the Slavs only emerged as a distinct group in the early medieval period. But paternal lineage alone isn't enough to explain the full Slavic genetic landscape. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited exclusively from the mother, reveals a surprising continuity between modern Slavs and the prehistoric populations of Central and Eastern Europe. Unlike the Y-chromosome, which shows clear signs of migration and expansion, maternal lineages suggest a long-standing, stable population base. This means that while male-driven migrations and conquests shaped the spread of Slavic culture, the women of these ancient communities carried a genetic legacy that predates even the formation of the Slavic identity. Another fascinating discovery comes from autosomal DNA, the mixed genetic material inherited from both parents. Studies comparing modern Slavic populations to ancient genomes show strong links to early European hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers, and even Bronze Age steppe nomads. The deep genetic connections between Slavs and Balts confirm that their ancestors shared a common genetic and cultural foundation before diverging into separate groups. Meanwhile, the genetic footprints of Turkic and Finno-Ugric peoples in some Slavic regions reveal centuries of interaction, trade, and, in some cases, assimilation. Yet, despite these outside influences, Slavic genetics show an unusual level of homogeneity across vast distances. Whether in Poland or Serbia, Slovakia or Belarus, the core genetic signature remains strikingly similar, reinforcing the idea of a shared ancestral population that expanded rapidly. But within this unity, subtle regional variations tell the stories of specific migrations, conquests, and intermarriages. For example, the southern Slavs, Serbs, Croats, and Bulgarians carry a noticeable Mediterranean and Anatolian influence, a genetic remnant of Roman and Byzantine rule. In contrast, northern Slavs, particularly those in Russia and Belarus, show a slight increase in Finno-Ugric and even Siberian ancestry, hinting at interactions with steppe nomads and indigenous Uralic groups. So what does this all mean? It means that the Slavs are not a people who simply emerged in the 6th century and spread across Europe like an unstoppable wave. Instead, their genetic roots run much deeper, intertwining with the very foundation of European prehistory. It means that history is not a straight line, but a complex web of movement, adaptation, and survival. It means that the Slavic identity, long seen as a product of medieval expansion, is in fact the result of thousands of years of evolution, migration, and cultural blending. For centuries, the Slavs have been at the center of one of history's most debated mysteries. Where did they come from? Traditional accounts place their origins in the vast forests and river valleys of Eastern Europe, but recent genetic discoveries suggest their ancestral homeland might be far older and more complex than previously thought. By analyzing ancient DNA from burial sites and comparing it to modern Slavic populations, researchers have begun to unravel the true story of the earliest Slavs, and it's not what most people expect. The search for the Slavic homeland has long been split between two competing theories. The Vistula-Oder hypothesis suggests that the Proto-Slavs originated in what is now Poland, slowly expanding outward over centuries. Meanwhile, the Middle Dnieper hypothesis places their roots in present-day Ukraine, arguing that early Slavs spread westward in response to external pressures. Genetic research, however, provides a new perspective, one that challenges both views while incorporating elements of each. Ancient Y-chromosome data shows a striking connection between early Slavic men and the Bronze Age corded ware culture, a group of steppe migrants who arrived in Central and Eastern Europe around 4,500 years ago. These warriors and pastoralists brought with them the R1a haplogroup, which would later become one of the defining genetic markers of Slavic populations. But here's the twist. While the corded ware people helped lay the foundation for Slavic genetics, they were not exclusively Slavic. Their DNA is also found in modern-day Germans, Scandinavians, and even some South Asians. This means that while early Slavs shared ancestry with these groups, they didn't yet exist as a distinct people. So when did the Slavs truly emerge? To answer that, we turn to the Iron Age, when a genetic shift appears in the populations of present-day Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. This period saw the rise of cultures like the Chernols and Zarabintsi, which many historians consider Proto-Slavic. Unlike the steppe warriors before them, These groups show a genetic continuity with later Slavic populations, indicating that a unique Slavic identity was beginning to take shape. The spread of specific maternal haplogroups, such as H5A and U5A2, also suggests that these communities were not just migrating men, but entire families moving and settling new lands. By the time the early medieval period arrived, the genetic blueprint of the Slavs had been firmly established. However, what truly set them apart was their explosive expansion across Europe in the 6th and 7th centuries. This rapid spread, long believed to be the result of migration alone, is now understood to have been a mix of both movement and cultural assimilation. Genetic studies show that in regions where Slavs settled, the local populations didn't simply disappear. Instead, there was a blending of people, as seen in the southern Balkans, where Slavic DNA mixed with Greek and Thracian lineages, creating the unique genetic makeup of modern Bulgarians and Macedonians. But if the Slavs were already present in Eastern Europe long before the medieval period, what drove them to expand so rapidly? One major factor was the collapse of the Roman Empire, which left a power vacuum in the Balkans. With weakened defenses and depopulated cities, Slavic groups were able to settle and integrate, spreading not just their genetics, but their language and culture. The genetic legacy of this period is still visible today, with Southern Slavs carrying a mix of Slavic, Roman, and even Anatolian ancestry, while Northern Slavs remain genetically closer to their original populations. Ultimately, genetics is rewriting what we thought we knew about the origins of the Slavs. Instead of a people who suddenly appeared in the early medieval period, the evidence suggests a much older, deeper lineage stretching back thousands of years. The Slavs were not just migrants or conquerors. They were part of a vast, interconnected web of European prehistory, shaped by the same forces that influenced the entire continent. And as genetic research continues to advance, we may find that the true story of the Slavs is even more intricate than we can imagine. For centuries, the Slavs have been viewed as a single, unified group, bound by language and culture. But when scientists began analyzing Slavic DNA on a deeper level, a startling discovery emerged. The Slavs are not as genetically homogeneous as once believed. Instead, hidden beneath their shared history lies a striking genetic divide that separates Northern and Southern Slavs in ways that defy geography, language, and even centuries of intermingling. One of the biggest surprises in Slavic genetics is the split between Northern Slavs, such as Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, Czechs, and Slovaks, and Southern Slavs, including Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, Bulgarians, and Macedonians. While their languages share a common root, their genetic profiles tell a different story. Recent Y-chromosome studies reveal that Northern Slavs overwhelmingly carry R1a, a haplogroup associated with ancient Indo-European migrations. But among Southern Slavs, particularly in the Balkans, a completely different pattern emerges. Instead of R1a dominance, we see a much higher presence of I2a, a lineage linked to the pre-Slavic populations of the Balkans, such as the Illyrians and Thracians. What this means is that when Slavs migrated into the Balkans during the 6th century, they didn't simply replace the existing populations. They merged with them. Over time, this blending of genes created a distinct Southern Slavic identity, one that carries both the legacy of the migrating Slavs and the deep-rooted ancestry of the Balkan Peninsula. This genetic contrast between Northern and Southern Slavs is so pronounced that some scientists argue they should be viewed as two distinct genetic groups rather than a single Slavic lineage. But this isn't just a story of ancient migrations. Even today, genetic studies show that Slavs from Poland, Russia, and Ukraine are more closely related to Baltic populations like Lithuanians and Latvians than they are to Southern Slavs. This suggests that Northern Slavs have remained relatively isolated in terms of genetic exchange, while Southern Slavs have experienced multiple waves of influence, including from Greeks, Romans, and even Turkic peoples during the Ottoman period. Maternal DNA adds another layer to this mystery. While Y-chromosomes trace paternal lineage, mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited from mothers, tells us about maternal ancestry. What researchers have found is that despite the paternal divide between Northern and Southern Slavs, their maternal lineages are remarkably similar. Haplogroups such as H5 and U5, which were present in early Slavic populations, are still found across both northern and southern Slavs today. This suggests that while Slavic men may have assimilated into existing populations through migration and conquest, Slavic women have played a key role in maintaining a genetic link across all Slavic groups. So, what does this genetic divide mean for the Slavic identity? At first glance, it might seem like a contradiction, the idea that a single ethnic and linguistic group could be so genetically diverse. But in reality, it tells a much deeper and richer story. Instead of being a monolithic group, the Slavs are a product of thousands of years of movement, mixing, and adaptation. The genetics of Slavs don't erase their shared identity. They enhance it, showing that their history is far more intricate than previously imagined. Ultimately, what genetic research reveals is that the Slavs are not defined by a single ancestral origin, but by a complex web of interactions that shaped them over centuries. Northern Slavs, with their deep Indo-European roots, and Southern Slavs, carrying the genetic imprint of the Balkans, are two sides of the same historical coin, united by language and culture, but shaped by very different genetic paths. And as more ancient DNA is uncovered, the true depth of Slavic diversity will continue to rewrite everything we thought we knew about the origins of one of Europe's largest ethnic groups. For decades, historians and archaeologists have debated the origins of the Slavs. Where did they come from? Were they native to Central Europe? Or did they migrate from the east in massive waves, as some theories suggest? While traditional history relied on written records and archaeology, modern genetics has introduced a game-changing piece of evidence, our own DNA. And when scientists began decoding Slavic genes, they uncovered something astonishing. The answer to the Slavic homeland has been hidden in their blood all along. One of the most persistent debates in Slavic history is whether the Slavs originated in Central Europe, between the Oder and Vistula rivers, or further east, in the Dnieper basin of present-day Ukraine. Until recently, both theories had their champions. Archaeologists pointed to cultural continuity in Poland, while linguists argued that the Slavic language spread too quickly for a purely Central European origin. But genetic studies are now tipping the scales. Y-chromosome analysis shows that Slavic men overwhelmingly belong to haplogroup R1a, a lineage that dates back thousands of years and is most common in Eastern and Central Europe. But the highest diversity of R1a isn't in Poland. It's in Ukraine. This is a crucial detail because in genetics, high diversity in a haplogroup often points to the place where it first emerged. This suggests that early Slavic tribes most likely originated in the middle Dnieper region, near present-day Kiev, before expanding westward into Poland and beyond. But there's another twist in the story. While Y-DNA points east, mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, which is passed down through the maternal line, reveals an older and more complex history. Many Slavic maternal lineages, like haplogroups H5 and U5, are found all over Central and Eastern Europe, dating back to the Bronze and even Neolithic periods. This suggests that while Slavic-speaking men spread outwards from Ukraine, they mixed with local populations of Central Europe, absorbing their maternal lineages into what we now call Slavic identity. So, does this mean the Slavs invaded Central Europe? Not exactly. Instead of a sudden large-scale migration, the genetic evidence suggests a gradual expansion, with early Slavs moving westward over centuries, blending with local groups rather than replacing them. This aligns with the historical record, which describes the Slavs as spreading through migration, intermarriage, and assimilation, rather than conquering through force like the Germanic tribes or the Huns. There's another crucial clue hidden in the DNA: the relationship between Slavs and the Balts, modern Lithuanians and Latvians. Despite speaking different language families today, genetic studies show that Balts and Northern Slavs are among the most closely related groups in Europe. This suggests that, thousands of years ago, their ancestors were part of the same population before diverging into separate linguistic and cultural identities. What does all of this mean for the origins of the Slavs? The genetic evidence strongly supports the idea that the Proto-Slavic homeland was in present-day Ukraine, in the middle Dnieper basin. From there, the Slavs expanded westward into Poland and Slovakia, southward into the Balkans, and northward into Russia. But instead of being a single, uniform group, the Slavs absorbed and mixed with the people they encountered, which is why modern Slavs, despite their shared language, are so genetically diverse. The story of the Slavic origins is not one of conquest, but of adaptation. Slavic genes reveal a people who moved, settled, and integrated, leaving a genetic footprint that stretches from the Baltic to the Adriatic, from the Alps to Siberia. And as new ancient DNA studies continue to emerge, they will only deepen our understanding of how the Slavs became one of the most widespread and enduring ethnic groups in Europe. For centuries, the Slavs have been seen as a distinct group, united by language and shared cultural traditions. But what if their genetic history tells a more complex story? Modern DNA research is revealing surprising connections between the Slavs and other ancient civilizations, links that stretch across thousands of miles and hundreds of generations. From the Roman Empire to the Mongol invasions, the genes of the Slavic people carry the echoes of past encounters, migrations, and even conquests. One of the most unexpected discoveries in Slavic DNA comes from the Balkans, where ancient genome studies have shown a heavy imprint of Anatolian and Roman influences. During the height of the Roman Empire, the Balkans were a major crossroads of civilization, home to Roman soldiers, traders, and settlers from all over the empire. Genetic studies have confirmed that some of these newcomers mixed with local populations, leaving behind markers of Mediterranean and Anatolian ancestry in modern-day Serbs, Croats, and Bulgarians. But despite this, the Slavic genetic component remains dominant, suggesting that while the Romans influenced the culture and infrastructure of the region, they left only a moderate impact on its deep ancestry. But the Balkans were not the only place where Slavic genes mixed with foreign influences. Another major genetic connection comes from the steppe nomads, the Scythians, Sarmatians, and later the Huns and Mongols. These warrior cultures roamed the Eurasian plains for centuries, and their influence can still be seen in certain Slavic populations today. DNA analysis has identified traces of East Eurasian haplogroups, such as C and D, in Poland and Ukraine, which are linked to ancient migrations from Siberia and Central Asia. These lineages likely arrived in waves, with early interactions dating back to the Iron Age and later intensifying during the Mongol invasion of the 13th century. One of the most fascinating cases of genetic exchange involves the Old Believers of Russia and the Slavicized Finno-Ugric peoples. Northern Russia, home to Slavic-speaking populations today, was once inhabited by Finno-Ugric tribes. Genetic studies show that some northern Russians carry unique markers more commonly found in Finno-Ugric populations, such as the N3 haplogroup, which is dominant in Estonians, Finns, and some Siberian peoples. Over time, these groups gradually adopted the Slavic language and culture, while still maintaining their distinct genetic heritage. This is why some northern Russians appear to have slightly different genetic profiles compared to their southern Slavic counterparts. Another unexpected connection comes from the Jewish diaspora. In Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine, genetic studies have found small traces of maternal haplogroups L2A and K1A1B1A, which are typically associated with Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. This is a direct reflection of historical migrations. During the Middle Ages, large Jewish communities settled in these regions, and over generations, intermarriage led to the incorporation of some Jewish maternal lineages into the broader Slavic gene pool. While the overall impact is relatively small, it serves as yet another reminder that the Slavic genetic history is not isolated. It is deeply intertwined with the broader history of Europe and beyond. So, what do these genetic connections tell us? First, they confirm that the Slavs did not develop in isolation. They were constantly interacting with neighboring civilizations. From Roman settlers in the Balkans to steppe nomads in Ukraine and Russia, from Finno-Ugric tribes in the north to Jewish communities in Poland, the Slavic genetic heritage is a layered tapestry of migrations, interactions, and cultural shifts. Yet, through all of these influences, the core Slavic genetic identity remained remarkably strong. The Slavic expansion during the early medieval period reinforced a shared genetic structure, making modern Slavs one of the most genetically cohesive groups in Europe, despite their diverse regional histories. Ultimately, DNA reveals that the history of the Slavs is not just about a single origin or one great migration. Instead, it is a story of constant adaptation and exchange, a history written not just in books, but in the very genes of millions of people today. For centuries, Historians have debated where the Slavs originally came from. Were they a people who slowly emerged from Central Europe over thousands of years, or did they expand suddenly, pushing out older populations and replacing them? Until recently, this debate relied mostly on archaeology and historical records, but now, genetics is giving us a much clearer answer. And what scientists are discovering is changing everything we thought we knew about Slavic origins. At the heart of the debate are two competing theories. The autochthonous theory suggests that the Slavs were always in Central and Eastern Europe, with their roots stretching back to the Bronze Age. On the other hand, the migrationist theory argues that Slavs were originally a smaller group who expanded rapidly from the Middle Dnieper region, modern-day Ukraine, around the 5th or 6th century AD, overwhelming local populations and spreading their language and culture. But which one is true? DNA evidence is starting to tip the balance in favor of the migrationist model. When scientists analyzed ancient DNA from remains in Poland, Slovakia, and Belarus, they found something surprising. Modern Slavic paternal lineages, Y-DNA, were largely absent in these regions before the early Middle Ages. This means that Slavs likely did not originate from these areas, but arrived later, replacing or mixing with the previous populations. In other words, the Slavs were not native to Poland or Central Europe. They moved in and spread rapidly. But where did they come from? Genetic studies have pinpointed the Middle Dnieper Basin in Ukraine as the most likely homeland of the early Slavs. This region shows the highest genetic diversity among Slavic populations, meaning it was likely the original source before they expanded outward. Supporting this, the Ukrainian population today sits at the center of Slavic genetic diversity, closely linked to both Western and Eastern Slavs. Yet, while male Y-chromosome data shows a clear migration pattern, the maternal lineage, mtDNA, tells a different story. Unlike paternal DNA, which suggests movement, maternal DNA shows strong continuity with older European populations, meaning Slavic expansion may not have been a violent conquest, but rather a gradual process of cultural assimilation. Instead of wiping out the older populations, the Slavs likely intermarried with them, slowly spreading their language and culture. One of the biggest surprises in genetic research has been the lack of strong Baltic influence in Slavic DNA, despite the historical closeness of these two groups. While Slavs and Balts were once thought to have shared a common origin, modern DNA shows a clear genetic distinction between them, particularly in their Y-chromosome lineages. The Balts have a much higher frequency of the N3 haplogroup, which is dominant in Finno-Ugric populations like Estonians and Finns, while Slavs are overwhelmingly dominated by R1a haplogroups, particularly the M458 subclade, which is almost entirely unique to them. This suggests that Proto-Slavs and Proto-Balts were distinct groups long before the Slavic expansion, rather than a single people who later split apart. So, does this mean that Slavic identity is purely the result of migration? Not exactly. The genetic evidence suggests a layered history. While the original Slavs likely expanded out of Ukraine, they encountered and mixed with local populations wherever they went, absorbing older European genetic lineages into their own. This is why, despite clear migration patterns, modern Slavs in Poland, Russia, and the Balkans still retain genetic markers from pre-Slavic inhabitants. In the end, what genetics tells us is that Slavic origins were not a single event, but a complex process of movement, assimilation, and adaptation. The idea that Slavs suddenly appeared and wiped out previous populations is an oversimplification. Instead, they spread gradually, merging with local groups, and over time, their language and identity became dominant. This means that the true history of the Slavs is not just about conquest or migration, but about integration, resilience, and evolution. And thanks to DNA research, we are finally able to see this hidden past with more clarity than ever before. For centuries, the Slavs have been considered a monolithic group, one vast ethnic and linguistic family stretching across Eastern and Central Europe. But modern genetics is telling a very different story. Beneath the surface, Slavic populations are far more diverse than previously thought, with unique genetic patterns shaped by thousands of years of migration, assimilation, and historical events. And when we break down the DNA, we find that not all Slavs are equally related to each other. The genetic divide among Slavs is most obvious when we look at the Y chromosome, which is inherited from father to son. Studies have shown that there are actually two major genetic clusters among Slavic populations. The first group includes Western Slavs, Eastern Slavs, and some Southern Slavs, Poles, Slovaks, Czechs, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and even Slovenes and some Croats. These populations share a high frequency of the R1a M458 haplogroup, which is a uniquely Slavic genetic marker. The second group, however, is where things get interesting. Serbs, Bulgarians, Macedonians, and some Croats are genetically distinct from the first group, with higher frequencies of I2 and E haplogroups, linking them more closely to older Balkan populations than to the Northern Slavic branch. This means that not all Slavs share the same paternal ancestry. Some, like Poles and Russians, descend from a common Slavic ancestor, while others, like Serbs and Bulgarians, have a significant genetic legacy from the ancient Illyrians, Thracians, and other pre-Slavic Balkan peoples. This challenges the idea that the Slavic migrations of the early Middle Ages completely replaced the populations of the Balkans. Instead, what likely happened was a cultural and linguistic assimilation, where the Slavic identity spread, but the genetics of the region remained deeply tied to its pre-Slavic past. But while paternal DNA shows this divide, the maternal lineage, the mtDNA inherited from mothers, tells a different story. Across all Slavic nations, maternal lineages are highly diverse, but they also show strong continuity with older European populations. This suggests that the Slavic migrations were largely male-dominated, with Slavic men settling in new territories and intermarrying with local women. Instead of wiping out older populations, they merged with them, creating the mixed genetic landscape we see today. And then there's the question of the Baltic connection. Historically, the Balts and Slavs have been grouped together due to linguistic similarities, and some theories even suggest they once formed a single Proto-Balto-Slavic people. But genetics tells a different story. While there is some overlap, particularly in Belarus and northern Russia, the Balts are genetically distinct from Slavs, with much higher frequencies of the N3 haplogroup, which is more common in Finno-Ugric populations. This means that, while Slavs and Balts were neighbors, they were never a single, unified group, and the differences between them have been deeply rooted for thousands of years. Another fascinating discovery comes from the Balkan region, where Slavic genetic influence fades as we move south. While Serbs, Croats, and Bulgarians show a mix of Slavic and pre-Slavic ancestry, the Slavic genetic imprint becomes much weaker in Greece and Romania. In fact, genetic studies show that while modern Greeks and Romanians may have some Slavic ancestry, especially in the north, their genetic roots are overwhelmingly linked to their ancient, pre-Slavic ancestors. This suggests that while Slavic culture and language may have spread to these regions, the genetic impact was much smaller than in places like Poland or Russia. So, what does all of this mean? It tells us that Slavs are not a single, homogeneous group, but a vast, diverse network of peoples who share a common language family but have very different genetic histories. Some Slavic nations, like Poland and Russia, have genetic roots that trace directly to the original Slavic expansion, while others, like Serbia and Bulgaria, are a blend of Slavic newcomers and the ancient populations who lived there before. This means that Slavic identity is more than just DNA. It's a complex mix of history, migration, and cultural evolution. And thanks to modern genetics, we are now uncovering the hidden diversity that has shaped the Slavic world for thousands of years. For centuries, the origins of the Slavs have been shrouded in mystery. Were they a single ancient tribe that expanded across Europe? Or were they a diverse group of peoples who later came to share a language and culture? Until recently, historians and archaeologists could only speculate. But now, thanks to genetic research, we are finally beginning to piece together the true story of Slavic origins. And the answer is far more complex than anyone had imagined. One of the biggest questions has always been, where did the Slavs come from? For decades, scholars debated two main theories. The first, known as the autonomous theory, suggested that the Slavs were native to Central Europe, in the region between the Oder and Vistula rivers, modern-day Poland. The second, the migration theory, argued that the Slavs originated further east, in the Dnieper River basin, modern Ukraine, and only expanded westward in the early Middle Ages. So what does DNA evidence say? Genetic studies show that many Slavic populations share deep genetic ties that go back thousands of years. The Y-chromosome haplogroup R1a M458, which is found at high frequencies in Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Ukrainians, and Russians, is a strong indicator of a common paternal ancestry. But here's where things get interesting. This lineage is much older than the early medieval Slavic expansion. In fact, it traces back to the Bronze Age corded ware culture, a group that lived in Central and Eastern Europe around 4,500 years ago. This means that the Slavs didn't just appear suddenly in the 6th century. Instead, their ancestors were likely already living in Central and Eastern Europe thousands of years earlier, long before they were ever called Slavs. And when the so-called Slavic expansion began, it may not have been a case of a small group of invaders spreading across Europe, but rather a cultural shift that united pre-existing populations under a new identity. But while the Y chromosome tells one story, mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, which is inherited from mothers, tells another. Unlike the male lineages, Slavic maternal lineages are far more diverse. This suggests that, rather than replacing earlier populations, the expansion of Slavs was mostly a process of assimilation, where Slavic-speaking men mixed with local women. This pattern is particularly clear in the Balkans, where southern Slavs like Serbs, Bulgarians, and Macedonians carry a mix of Slavic paternal markers, but maternal DNA that is largely indigenous to the region. One of the most surprising findings comes from the Baltic connection. Some linguists have long suggested that the Slavic and Baltic languages, like Latvian and Lithuanian, stemmed from a common ancestor. But does their DNA support this? The answer is yes and no. While Balts and Slavs do share some genetic overlap, especially in Belarus and northern Russia, Baltic populations have far higher frequencies of haplogroup N3, which is common among Finno-Ugric peoples. This suggests that while the two groups were neighbors and may have shared some ancestry, they were never a single people. Another key discovery is the role of historical migrations in shaping Slavic genetics. The early medieval period was a time of massive upheaval, with migrations of Huns, Avars, Bulgars, and Magyars reshaping the genetic landscape of Eastern Europe. Some Slavic groups, like Poles and Russians, show little evidence of these outside influences, while others, like Bulgarians and Croats, have clear genetic traces of contact with non-Slavic steppe nomads. And then there's the question of the Slavic homeland. The genetic data suggests that the most likely location for the origin of the Slavs was in modern-day Ukraine, in the Middle Dnieper region. This aligns with historical sources that describe early Slavs living in this area before spreading westward and southward. It also explains why Ukraine sits at the center of the genetic network of Slavic populations, showing connections to both Western and Eastern Slavs. So, what does all of this tell us? It reveals that Slavic origins are far more complex than a simple migration story. Instead of a single Slavic tribe emerging and conquering new lands, what we see is a gradual process of cultural and linguistic unification among ancient populations who were already living in Central and Eastern Europe. The Slavs didn't simply invade new territories. They formed through centuries of interaction, expansion, and assimilation. And that's what makes the story of the Slavs so fascinating. Their history isn't just about wars and migrations. It's about how different peoples came together to create one of the largest linguistic and cultural families in the world today. For centuries, the Slavic people have been seen as a homogeneous group, united by language and shared history. But when we dig deeper into genetics, a much more complex and unexpected picture emerges. Slavic DNA reveals stories of migration, assimilation, and survival, stories that history books have only begun to uncover. So, what does modern genetics tell us about the true diversity of the Slavic world? At first glance, the Y-chromosome DNA of Slavic populations seems to suggest strong genetic unity. The R1a haplogroup, particularly the M458 subclade, is found in Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Ukrainians, and Russians at high frequencies, linking them to common paternal ancestors. But when we look beyond the shared marker, the differences begin to stand out. For example, Southern Slavs like Serbs, Croats, and Bulgarians have far lower levels of R1a and instead show significant influence from Illyrians, Thracians, and steppe nomads like the Avars and Bulgars. This pattern suggests that Slavic expansion was not a simple process of conquest or mass migration. Instead, it involved small groups of Slavic-speaking men settling among and mixing with local populations, adopting and influencing local cultures. This is why, despite speaking related languages, Slavic peoples today carry such distinct genetic signatures. One of the most surprising aspects of Slavic genetics comes from mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, which is passed from mother to child. Unlike paternal lineages, which are relatively uniform across Slavic nations, maternal lineages show striking diversity. This suggests that as Slavic men migrated and settled in new lands, they often took local wives, gradually absorbing non-Slavic maternal lineages into the Slavic gene pool. In the Balkans, for example, mtDNA reveals strong genetic continuity with pre-Slavic populations, meaning that Southern Slavs are, to a large extent, the descendants of ancient Illyrians, Thracians, and Greeks, who adopted Slavic languages over time. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, the genetic imprint of early Scythian and Sarmatian tribes can still be found, particularly in Russia and Ukraine. Another fascinating aspect of Slavic genetic diversity is the influence of non-European ancestry. While most Slavic groups are primarily of European descent, traces of Central Asian and even Siberian DNA appear in some populations. The presence of haplogroups like C4, D, and G, which are common in Altaic and Siberian peoples, suggests that Slavs had direct genetic contact with steppe nomads like the Huns, Avars, and Mongols. This is especially noticeable in populations from Russia and Bulgaria, where genetic markers from the east are slightly more pronounced. What's even more surprising is the genetic connection between Slavs and Ashkenazi Jews. Certain mtDNA haplogroups like L2A, which originated in the Middle East, are found in Polish and Ukrainian populations, likely due to centuries of interaction between Slavs and Jewish communities. In fact, many Jewish lineages show strong genetic overlap with East European Slavs, highlighting a history of shared ancestry and coexistence. And then there's the question of the Balto-Slavic connection. Linguistically, the Baltic and Slavic languages are closely related, but does DNA support this link? The answer is both yes and no. While Balts and Slavs share some common Y-DNA markers, Baltic populations, particularly Lithuanians and Latvians, have significantly higher levels of haplogroup N3, which is associated with Finno-Ugric peoples. This suggests that while early Balts and Slavs may have shared some common ancestors, they eventually took different genetic and cultural paths. Genetics also helps explain one of the biggest mysteries of Slavic history: the origins of the Western Slavs, particularly the Poles, Czechs, and Slovaks. Some early theories suggested that these groups descended from ancient Germanic tribes who later adopted Slavic languages. But DNA strongly disproves this theory. Instead, the genetic evidence shows that Western Slavs share deep genetic roots with Eastern Slavs, suggesting they were part of the same original Slavic expansion. So, what does all of this tell us? It tells us that Slavic identity was never about being a single, uniform group. Instead, Slavic history is a story of interaction, adaptation, and transformation. The Slavs didn't just spread across Europe, they blended with the people they encountered, creating the rich diversity we see today. And that's the hidden secret of Slavic genetics. It's not about purity or isolation, but about connection and complexity. Behind the shared language and culture lies a history of migration, assimilation, and resilience, a history that continues to shape the Slavic world today.